As you're settling in, we are pleased to offer the session in both English and French. So I will request everyone to please listen carefully as we make sure that you're set up in the correct language. So right now at the bottom of your screen, you will see a little globe icon, and the globe icon says interpretation. So please click the globe icon and click the language that you want to listen and hear in. So if you are an English speaker, then please click interpretation and click English. And then you will hear everything spoken in English, and anything that will come out during the session will be in English as well. As I say this, I also want to let you know that there's a couple of housekeeping items with regards to technology. So we have interpreters, Louise, Natalie, and Natalie, who will be interpreting in both English and French. We ask for everyone to please mute your mic at all times, except when you're speaking. And then when you are speaking, please speak clearly at a moderate speed and avoid cross-talking to make their lives easier. We are also joined today by my colleagues Isaac and Geneviève, who will be providing English and French language text support in the chat box. Our youth note taker Hunter will be capturing key insights for today's session. So one last time for anybody who is joining us new, please click interpretation. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a bright green kind of button. Next to it will be polling, reactions, and then a globe that says interpretation. Click interpretation and then click the language that you want to listen and hear in, either English or French. Okay, so with that being said, I will now turn it over to Samantha, who will start us off.
Cool. Ani, bonjour, everyone. Welcome to our session. I am going to start, sorry, I just got distracted by some feedback. I'm going to start with the land acknowledgements. So today I'm joining you all from Treaty 4 in Regina. It's the homeland of the Nehiyawak, the Anishinaabeg, the Dakota, Lakota, Nakota. It's also the homeland of the Métis. I'm usually based out of Thunder Bay, which is on the north shore of Lake Superior, in the Robinson-Superior Treaty Territory of 1850, and on the homelands of the Anishinaabeg and the Métis. And so, yeah, just wanted to begin by acknowledging the territories that we're on, and really doing that to acknowledge that we're not entitled to the land, but that we acknowledge the land and the waters and the gift that it is to take up space here. So thank you for choosing the session on policies and system change. And really, like, one of my goals here with this session is to think about, like, sometimes policies and systems can feel really abstract or really intangible. But have incredible impacts on lived experience on the ground. And so that's what I want to kind of illustrate through the different panelists, is how systems change actually affects the lived experience of community members on the ground. So hopefully, hopefully it's interesting for you, and you can continue to make more linkages between policies and systems and the welfare of your community. So also, I'm just going to start us off with a few ground rules for participation. So number one, I just want to invite people to hold back judgment. Everyone's voice and perspective is equally valued, and we want to allow space for people to speak and share what's on their mind. Number two, Nijin, we want to respect the privacy of others and people's own comfort level in contributing. And number three, we want everyone to participate, and there's zero tolerance for racist or discriminatory comments, ideas, or views. And number four, Niwin, please stay focused on the topic. So in our time together, we cannot cover everything, and we just want to remind everyone that this is a journey that we can continue together after this event, after this workshop. And number five, Nyanin, we want to build on the ideas of others. So during conversations, try to use yes and instead of but. So again, so during conversations, during Q&A, try to use yes and instead of but. Number 6, cinco toi, so want to have one conversation at a time. So we're more likely to build a great conversation if everyone is paying full attention to whomever is sharing their thought. So while in the background, please ensure that you're muted if you're not speaking. Cool. So yeah, so I'm going to invite our panelists. We're going to start with Robin to sort of talk about where she's seen, where she's been a part of like systems change in her work. Robin is a dear friend of mine and a former colleague of mine. She currently works at the Thunder Bay Public Library, but I'll let her continue to introduce herself. So Robin, do you want to unmute yourself and just begin by sharing a bit of about yourself and your work?
Sure. Hi, Bonjour. Robin Medicine, Indigenous, Rainy River, Ninjunji, Makwan, Nindudem. So I just introduced myself in Ojibwe. I am Robin Medicine. I am originally from Manitou Rapids or Rainy River First Nation, which is on Treaty 3 territory, and I am from the Bear Clan. So I am currently in Thunder Bay. I work at the Thunder Bay Public Library as the Community Hub Librarian for Indigenous Relationships. I'm still new in that position, but I'll get into that a little bit later. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here, and I'm so excited to see so many young people interested in learning about policy change and systems change, and I hope I hope this inspires you to get involved in the work that we're going to be talking about. So should I just get into it?
Yeah, sure. If you want to start with maybe, well, maybe I'll just share just very briefly for maybe those who are unfamiliar with the context of Thunder Bay, just at a high level. Like Thunder Bay is a small isolated city on the north shore of Lake Superior. It's a city of 110,000 and 130,000 in the greater area, and it's fairly isolated from other major urban hubs. And it's a city where, according to StatsCan, it's 13% Indigenous, but by more accurate measures, is closer to 38% Indigenous. So that's just a little bit of like what the city is like. But yeah, do you want to maybe start, Robin, by sharing a little bit about the Thunder Bay Public Library, kind of at a high level, just for people who have never heard of all the great work you're doing there?
Sure, that's kind of in my presentation, but as I talk about, when I started there. So I wonder if I should just get into it.
Yeah, sure. Let's start with that. Start with like how you started at TVPL.
Okay. So in my bio, if you haven't read it, I highlight my education in Aboriginal community advocacy work. This program was fundamental in preparing me for the various policy and systems changes that I have been able to make as the former Indigenous liaison intern at the Thunder Bay Public Library. So I was hired in 2016 as the first Aboriginal liaison intern. That's what it was called at the time. And it was basically to help engage with Indigenous people in Thunder Bay and to, create a space that was relevant for Indigenous people. Because as Sam said, that we do have a higher and growing Indigenous population in Thunder Bay. We serve a lot of isolated communities. People come here for school, Indigenous people come here from around the region for education, healthcare, housing, all kinds of things. So yeah, we serve a lot of Indigenous people at the library. So I really enjoyed, obviously I enjoyed working at the library. I'm still there. It is important for me to point that out because it will give you a better understanding of how I was able to implement change and how some of the challenges that I faced within an inherently white institution as an Indigenous person. So, like I said, I was the first Indigenous liaison intern. And one of the first things that I did was form the first Indigenous Advisory Council for the Thunder Bay Public Library. This was a way for me to connect with the Indigenous community, give Indigenous community an opportunity to have input into what they would like to see out of a public library. This was actually pivotal in being able to include Indigenous perspectives at and within the library. So the role of the Indigenous Advisory Council is to serve as advisors to library staff and management. So I chair and facilitate monthly advisory council meetings, and we talk about various things. For the Indigenous Advisory Council, it's very open. There's not an age limit, and yeah, it's a very diverse group of people. So it's good to have various perspectives. And
yeah, maybe before you move on, can I just add something?
Sure.
Yeah, just as you're talking, I'm just remembering about like how in some ways like revolutionary it was and is to have an Indigenous Advisory Council. And just thinking it from like a systems perspective, like libraries are often institutions like dominated by like middle class white women. And so to get the perspective of like your average Anishinaabe Indigenous person in the community, like those voices were not being incorporated, right? And so when we think about like all the systems that like systems within systems that make up a public library, it was really and continues to be like founded in whiteness, right? And so what you did in creating the Indigenous Advisory Council is in some ways like quite like groundbreaking, right? Because it's for the first time saying, oh, like community members, the people from this land, from this place are actually going to speak into what needs to change in these systems that are like in many ways like founded on white supremacy, right? So yeah, anyways, do you want to share a little bit more about the IAC, or do you want to move on?
I'll actually, that's a good segue into highlighting some of the ways in which that the IAC was able to influence some of the changes to policy and systems within the library. So there's several projects that I could share of success stories and things about the IAC, but I want to focus on two today. One being it's a big one, opening Indigenous knowledge centers within each of the 4 libraries. So the Thunder Bay Public Library has 4 locations, and in each one we had created a space that was separate from the rest of the library, not to segregate or anything like that. It was to showcase and to highlight and feature authentic resources that included books, DVDs, music, art, everything produced by Indigenous peoples. This was unique because it really rearranged the way that people, it rearranged the way that people could browse the collection. Sorry, and so we started to recategorize, I guess, the collection, moving away from the colonial Dewey Decimal System, and creating subject headings and topics that were relevant to the material. And this made it so much easier and accessible for Indigenous patrons and users of the library. And the Indigenous Advisory Council had provided input and really helped create the space and came up with the topics and subject headings. And so their involvement was included, like, since day one. Like, they were very important in making this change happen. We also had consulted with other advisory councils, like the city's Elders Advisory Council. And yeah, so as a result, we opened 4 Indigenous Knowledge Centers at the Thunder Bay Public Library. in this though, like as great as this was for Indigenous patrons, it did disgruntle some of some of my coworkers. But I don't spend too much time dwelling on this because I knew it was obvious. I was obviously doing something right, and that I was doing it for my community. So I think that's something important that I would like to highlight.
Yeah. Maybe I can just summarize right there real quick.
Sure.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you for sharing that about the Indigenous Knowledge Centers. So yeah, so again, thinking about how like such incredible work that you were part of in like within this like system, like within the Dewey Decimal System, saying, no, we're going to create actually a new system adjacent to that system that will actually serve Anishinaabe community members, right? And so there's sections now within each of the 4 branches of the Thunder Bay Public Library where Indigenous content is housed. Nonfiction by, like you said, like subject title that or subject like theme that that was created to respond to community needs. So using non-academic language, but using language in Anishinaabe and the Ojibwe language, using themes that were more accessible, and then organizing fiction by author's surname. Really, really incredible stuff. And yeah, just as you're talking, I guess I didn't really share about it. Yeah, like I used to work at the Thunder Bay Public Library with Robin, and so I got to like inherit a lot of her legacy when I joined and build off of like what she had been doing. And I remember like so often I'd hear from Anishinaabe community members, they'd say, "Wow, like this is incredible! Like to have a space that was like just centered on Indigenous content." And I think another piece of like creating that like systems change, that policy shift within the public library was also about the space itself. And I remember in my first month there, I was like, you know what, we need a mural here. And so, and I had just moved to Thunder Bay like within the past year, so I didn't know that many people, but I knew one person who was like kind of artsy. And so I texted her and I said, do you know any people who can paint? Because I need a mural. And she says, me, I'm a muralist, hire me. And I said, okay, you're hired. You can, this is what I need. This is what I can pay you. She said, sure. And then it occurred to me after I'd sort of just, you know, given her my word that we'd hire her. I had never seen her artwork before. I had no idea if she was any good. But thankfully, I looked her up on Instagram right afterwards. She's quite talented. And so we ended up getting this beautiful mural of the 7 grandfathers of the different, our non-human living kin, like throughout one of the Indigenous Knowledge Centers. So yeah, great example of like creating new systems within colonial white systems. But yeah, so I guess we can move on from there if you want to chat about the smudging policy, or did you have more to share? Yeah?
No.
Okay.
So I'll again, great segue into creating a safe space and a welcoming space for Indigenous people. Another success story, I guess, for the IAC and I guess myself was to create a smudging policy, which would allow Indigenous people to come in and smudge in a public space such as the library. We are still, this was a bit challenging, to put it lightly. There was a lot of educating that needed to happen for staff, of course, and but you know it happened, and we're we're able to smudge in each of the libraries, and I think it's important it's definitely important for Indigenous communities to be able to practice ceremony within a space, because we do have a lot of programming space, and we have a lot of gatherings at the library, and being able to smudge for special events or any programs, it's great. It's amazing to be able to do that now, because before we weren't able to, right? So
yeah, I was just gonna add something, if that's okay. Yeah, I think just something that's coming to mind, like as you're sharing about that smudging policy, because maybe for some people joining from across the country, you might think like, wow, Thunder Bay's in the Stone Ages, they didn't have a smudging policy. And in many ways, you would be correct. But when I think about like, yeah, creating systems change and like what it meant to have a smudging policy, like in some ways it's so infuriating that there was ever a time where it was restricted, right? Because really, like, we've been here since time immemorial, practicing our own ways of knowing creator, and really, like, it's for a brief time that there's been a public library institution that has restricted that, right? And so it's really like a returning to how we've always done things. And so I think that's important for those of you who are maybe like advocating or fighting for policy changes and systems changes within super colonial racist institutions. Yeah, to like be assured that like you're doing good work, especially when it's around decolonization, because we've been doing this since time immemorial, and to not be discouraged when there's so much racist, ignorant pushback, right? Because yeah, we have a right to be here. You wanna say more on the smudging policy, or?
No, I'm pretty much done there. So I just want to wrap up. I think my 10 minutes is almost up. So
Okay.
I guess what I want to leave you with is I wanted to take this opportunity to encourage each of you to get involved in advisory councils in your area. There are all sorts of youth councils and advisory councils in various sectors. And if you don't know where to start, maybe just ask yourself what you're passionate about. This could be education, health, law, public service, mental health, anything like that. And then also ask yourself, like, what are unique and diverse skill sets that I have to offer? That might help you narrow it down. I know school boards have advisory councils, public libraries now. I think that's becoming a thing. Indigenous advisory councils, that is, but I know youth advisory councils are very popular at public libraries, so if that's something you're interested in. And yeah, if you're still stuck, you can literally Google youth advisory councils and there's a lot that pop up. So yeah, learn their mandate, and it's important too, because it's important to specific organizations because you could actually help them inform internal policies and procedures. You might even influence the services that they provide. And finally, you can help develop new services and programs and initiatives that they may not have considered before. This could be important to you as well, meaning you could benefit from it, because by joining an advisory council, not only gives you a voice at the table, but it could actually benefit you professionally. So your involvement in an advisory council can earn you reference letters for scholarships, and they're voluntary as well. So if you need to earn community involvement volunteer hours, you could join a council and they will get, that will go towards your volunteer hours. And then you can also just gain experience in being on a committee and potentially a board someday. And some provide honorariums as well. So yeah, I just want to leave you by saying, you all have a voice, and I want you to know that we want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you so much, Robin. That's so good. Yeah, like, definitely want to encourage people to look for ways in which they can get involved in their communities in advisory councils, and to be encouraged. Like, I know sometimes being on an advisory council can be like a challenging or frustrating experience, but I want to encourage people who are considering it that it can really be worth it, because sometimes it takes like sometimes staff members are advocating for change within their organizations, but then it takes like a community member also asking for it to be that final push to create some meaningful change. So yeah, so really good stuff. Thank you so much, Robin. Yeah, so I guess now we'll transition over to Jordan. Jordan is a good friend of mine. I've known him for years and years, and he does something now with food. And so I'm going to pass it over to him. He's going to lead us first in a little stretch break. But I guess actually first, I'll get him to introduce himself and then he'll lead us in a stretch break.
Yeah, sure. So Tante Italia, Jordan Nasigarsan, Waipero, Chinia, Saskatoon, Miniquan, Miigwats. So as Sam said, my name is Jordan and I am from White Bear First Nation, which is on Treaty 4, actually, close to the Manitoba border, if that's a helpful reference. But I'm living here in Saskatoon on Treaty 6 territory. So yeah, as she said, I'm just going to start us off. I'm not going to lead you into it. It's more of like an invitation to do it if you want to. Really just like take a couple minutes if your Wi-Fi allows you, or if you can like get up and leave, like get outside and just be outside for a minute. Go outside, feel the sun, the wind, the rain, whatever it is on your body, and just like note the sensation that creates or arises. And yeah, we'll come back here and I'll start talking because I'm already outside. So I'm just going to relax and like, it's hot here in Saskatoon currently. Like the sun is really beaming down, which is quite nice. I got my feet on the grass and there's like lots of ants in my backyard. So they're always like climbing up my legs, which is kind of fun. I'm sure there's outside noises you guys are picking up on. I think I can hear some sirens out there. It's, you know, we're also in the urban. Yeah, because I don't know about you guys, but I've been having, I'm currently actually under isolation, so I've had to like be inside for the past little while. My backyard is a bit of a sanctuary, but yeah, lots of Zoom calls, lots of sitting, even though like I'm still kind of currently sitting. I'm just going to go for a quick little lap around my yard and I'll be right back.
Yeah, so I want to encourage you guys too, if you want to get up and stretch, go for a little walk. Yeah, feel embodied during this brief little stretch break. Nice, Trisha. Yoga stretches are the best. I've often done some of those on calls.
Yes. Yeah, it's even like rest in and of itself is a small like micro step of system change, because the way the system and like policies are set up right now, there's not a lot of room for rest, and a lot of times we even feel restless in our resting periods and feel like we need to be making plans or being productive or whatever, but that's simply not true. You know, we can just take time to be and to exist as we are, and that's enough. Yeah, do I just go or?
Yeah. So do you want to begin by explaining like a bit about where you work and a little bit at a high level what that work is about?
Right. Okay, so I work for an organization called Chep Good Food, and it started out as a nonprofit community-based food program organization about a little over 30 years ago, and it started out as an acronym standing for Child Hunger Education Program. So right off the hop, Chep was like a system changer from the beginning, because it was just a group of women who were concerned that when children come to school hungry, they don't learn well. So they just started by providing lunches at school, and that's how Chep began way back in the day. And then it kind of, as the years went by, they kind of slowly started to piece on different food related programs. And that's whether it's like a good food box program or supporting community gardens. And the thing that I got introduced to CHEP through, which is kind of like a gardening internship program. And now with the work that I'm kind of doing right now, which is looking at Indigenous food sovereignty and trying to really expand the understanding of those sorts of things. So CHEP has been a kind of a dynamic responsive organization over the past few years. And even over the past year, as COVID kind of came upon us, food insecurity kind of just like heightened even more than it was in food secure areas. And that effect was felt all over the globe for sure. But one of the things that we did is really everyone at the organization just kind of banded together, and we just pivoted to create a good food delivery box instead of, because the good food box operates on a depot-based system where people come and pick up their boxes. But with COVID, having everyone like come to one location and whatnot was problematic. So our staff team of 12 decided to pack like, I don't know, 200 boxes like twice a week and then deliver them. So that's what we did.
Awesome. And then do you want to get into a little bit about like how some of the work you're doing right now is about like assessment for where there needs to be like systems change?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. So to talk about that, I'll actually talk a little bit about my time, like how I came through CHEP. So I came through as, like I said, through an intern program called the Ski Project, which is a Cree word for earth. And it is a container garden that's built on top of a brownfield, because all across Canada and probably North America and probably the globe by now, obviously, there are lots of brownfields, like land that just has contaminated soil. So this particular piece of land used to be a fuel processing site back in the 60s. And the way they used to decommission that was they would just like level everything and then bury it and call it a day, which is like super destructive and terrible for the environment. And then they just like leave them there. So there's so many brownfields that go completely unutilized. And so that's where the Ski Project came in, is it became not just a container garden for growing food, but also a place for Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth to come and learn about growing food together, but also learn about the impacts of the current food system on the community. So we would kind of get tours of like major grocery stores or like a food depot and get to see kind of like inside of like the current food system and the way it is. And it's pretty crazy, honestly, how much food and resources are kept at these depots, the amount of water that's just sitting there. And like they have these things called banana rooms, which are like $1 million, like huge freezer where they put bananas in there and they pump in this chemical called ethylene, which ripens the bananas. So they have them like, we'll have like 5 different ones at 5 different stages. And stage 5 is the one that you see in the grocery store. So all these things are like conditioned in a way to present the food that we have and that we know. And like most bananas come from like the Philippines or California, and that's not exactly local. So those are just like some insights that we were able to gain about the current food system. And then I after the internship, I became an urban agriculture assistant. So I just kind of helped out with the garden and other forms of the internship and kind of helping develop more of indigenized or decolonized protocols around them. And then we used to have an Indigenous foods coordinator, and then she had retired and her place didn't get filled. And at a strategic meeting at our staff meeting last year, we realized that we didn't have that role anymore, but we have an Indigenous person who's working for the organization. So I kind of stepped up in a way and created this job where now my role mostly consists of kind of like what you said, like scoping and assessing the landscape of food in the immediate Saskatoon, and then kind of like in the region, kind of rippling out. And I'm hoping to gain some relationship and some permission to be in connection with those local First Nations and urban Indigenous folks, Métis folks in the city, and other Indigenous folks who have a hard time finding like their own foods, either in an urban setting or in an on-reserve setting. So that's kind of a lot of what I'm doing right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing. I think that's so important. Like when we think about like what does it mean to be involved in systems change and policy change? Maybe some people, their instinct is to do research first, but mine is to like go in there like kicking and screaming and like change all the things, you know, and I just want to get stuff done. But I have learned that sometimes it is important to like do an assessment, to do some like background research and to see yeah, where did the shifts need to happen? Where are those levers for change? And so that's a really good example of how like part of systems change work is that background research and assessment. Do you wanna share a bit about like systemic policies that you've encountered in your work that you're like, oh, this needs to change, and if this changed, this would be different for communities. This would be different for health outcomes.
Yeah, so all of what I'm about to share actually is what I'm going to be sharing. I got invited to a board meeting actually in May. So I'm going to be kind of sharing some of my vision, because really I think a lot of what CHEP does is like good work, and it does help address food security and kind of helps alleviate some of those poverty induced symptoms that we see and experience. But I think a lot of what our work also kind of does is like a little bit of a band-aid, right? Because like we have access to bulk buying, and that's how we're able to provide food at like really low costs via like markets and good food box and things like that. But it's still just kind of like, we're passing the buck sort of thing. And so I think a lot of what are the next iteration of like CHEP would involve a lot of decolonizing, and probably more like advocacy based, because a lot of the barriers that exist to decolonizing the food system or making indigenous foods more accessible have to do with policy. And that's why, like you said, it's important to understand the system that like you're operating in, and the system that the system that is up against you is like, I didn't choose to go up against the system. This system was made against me. And so it's sometimes it feels like we're up against it, but it's actually it is against us. And I think recognizing that like that tension that does exist is real, and it can feel it in our bodies. But a lot of the changes need to happen are from policies, because it's the policies that are these, like you say, these like abstract kind of like paper text things that are very like definition based and very like super colonial, and don't have a lot of room for indigenous worldview and like indigenous like personhood in itself. And like a few things that come to mind right away are things that have to do with trespassing or no hunting. Like we can see these signs up all over rural Saskatchewan and probably other rural parts of the country. And, if we take away those two things in of itself, like you can have people that can like move with the animals through land that wasn't historically privatized or owned. And so there's lots of people who are trying to do work to kind of shift some of those things. I know there's land sharing or like treaty farmers who like try to offer their land to treaty folks as well. There's people who are doing that work. Other aspects of the policy include stuff around food safe handling. So a lot of them will like deliberately say like no country foods can be sold or purchased, and you'll be fined if you do. And that right there is like literally a wall for any indigenous person, because like that's where our food comes from. It's from the land. It's not from another land that's had to be, that also gets like the short end of the stick in this kind of crazy system that isn't feeding the world. A lot of the research that I've done is weird. It comes from post World War II, this like idea that they could feed the world with the crops that we have here in North America, and that is it's never been true, because the issue isn't food. The issue is poverty, and that's really what colonialism as a system creates, is inequality, and out of those inequalities you get poverty, and through poverty, like you can't buy food if you're impoverished. So there's these things are set up to keep people this way, and to keep them from fighting the system, quote unquote. And so like organizing and having your voice heard is very important.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jordan. Just as you're sharing, like I'm reminded of a couple things. Like I just remember like when I was working at the library with Robin, like when we would cater meals, like there's like restrictions around like with like the public health units around serving game in public spaces. And I think sometimes, like if you've grown up, as we all have, like under colonialism, your default instinct can be like, oh, well, that makes sense. Like you need to make sure that things are safe. But the reality is that we've been here since time immemorial, and we know how to hunt, and we know how to prepare game safely, and we don't need like colonial institutions like the health unit telling us what is safe and unsafe. We've actually been here a little bit longer than them, right? So we know just a couple more things, maybe.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah. We know what's up.
So,
Yeah, this is a moose.
yeah, yeah. And so, yeah, part of that, like the system shifts that need to happen within access to traditional foods, like for like all the health outcomes that we want to see and like education outcomes. It's really just like unraveling, unpeeling like colonial nonsense, right? Because actually we know what foods work for us, and actually we just need like colonizers to get out of our way a little bit.
True.
Yeah. So yeah,
Which
really
is why
good.
decolonizing is a much more better term than indigenizing or even reconciliation, because and I think when people hear decolonize, sometimes they get a little like, they get the clench about it, because in a very like dualistic fashion, you'd feel like that's kind of like anti-colonialism, like no more colonialism, this kind of like super violent way. But really it's just to divest power from the colonial system, to create a way that helps share the power, because the colonial system doesn't share power, and that's really what decolonizing is.
Yeah, so good. I'm thinking we might have to move on for time, but is there anything else, like when you think about your work and you think about, maybe this is the question, like what would you say to a young person who is like interested in systems change and maybe even specifically around food? Like what would you say to them? Because they're
I
here.
would say exactly what Robin said, like get involved with a youth council or like a youth initiative, a youth, like there are lots of these things being created, and there's lots of people and organizations and even institutions, the government bodies, like municipal, like city bodies, that are looking for youth voices. And there's this thing in science called the moderate disruption hypothesis. And if there's something that has low disruption, it can't thrive. And if it has too much disruption, it can't thrive. But if it has somewhere in the middle, a balance, a moderate level of disruption, it can thrive. So I would say that as my like encouragement is to like try and get out there, find other people who are, about your age, some peers, and like just go to organizations, maybe ask them like, do you want to be accountable to some youth? Here we are. Like just try, right? This idea of like having a little bit of like disruption happen is good. And I think youth are like really good at that. And I think if the organization is like good and they're wanting to, continue on as an organization, they'll probably want you at least around, and like, or at least be open to a dialogue about like how they can somehow have that be a part of their board or their strategic planning or whatever it is. So yeah, try and find some people, and harness that positive energy and try to propel it forwards in that way.
Awesome. Hi, miigwech. Thank you. Yeah, so good. Just want to encourage people to think about ways where you might want to be involved in systems shifting and policy change. And yeah, just to summarize a bit, especially like around food, like these things like no trespassing or restrictions around hunting or restrictions around like access to game for like catered events, like that has a direct impact on people's like health outcomes, right? That's part of why we have diabetes crisis. That's part of poor outcomes in school, right? So they're sometimes they can seem like abstract or like intangible because they're laws or policies that exist in intangible ways, but they have directly tangible consequences on health and well-being, right? So yeah, thank you so much, Jordan. So I'm just gonna share a little bit about like ways in which I've been involved in systems change. And I guess I'm sorry, guys, like I didn't really properly introduce myself at the beginning, got all excited, but Samantha Netishnikas, Peguis Netonchi. Okay, my name is Sam. My family comes from Peguis First Nation on Treaty 1. Peguis is a reserve about 3 hours north of Winnipeg, but my family never left East Selkirk, which is where the reserve used to be before it was illegally amalgamated in 1906. I grew up in Southern Ontario in Kitchener-Waterloo, moved around a lot. I now live in Thunder Bay, although I'm not there right now, but that's where I live. And yeah, also I work with the MasterCard Foundation, specifically in Indigenous programming, looking at how we can create systems change in Indigenous access to education and employment, which is really exciting stuff. But I think actually what I'm going to talk about right now is something a little bit adjacent to that. We were talking about like youth councils and boards, or I guess just specifically youth councils. I'm going to talk about boards now. And so yeah, I'll just share a little story. I think it was like last fall, and someone reached out to me for a coffee who's involved with a lot of boards in the city of Thunder Bay. And he was encouraging me to get involved in different municipal boards. And so for those of you who are unaware, I'm not sure what it's like maybe in bigger cities like Toronto, if it's like more competitive, but in small cities like Thunder Bay, it's not that competitive. There's basically boards upon boards, and this is like part of like how the city runs is through these like citizen-led boards. Like the art gallery has one, the police have one, that's probably a like bigger deal one. There's the library has a board. All these like municipal institutions have boards, and a lot of them have positions like reserved for young people or just for regular old schmucks, you know, like me. So I was looking at these boards, and there was all sorts. There was ones focused on the environment. There was ones focused on like preserving heritage buildings. And then I saw this one and it kind of caught my eye a little bit. It's called the Official Recognition Committee. And what they do is they award citizens for like exceptional merit. And a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of those awards are based around like volunteerism. And so I was like, oh, this is interesting. I didn't know our city did this. And I went to go look at like who has been a previous awardee, I guess, of this. And it was 100% white people. And this is in a city, right, of like nearly like 38% Indigenous people. And also like, it's quite small, but like other racialized minorities as well. And so I was like, how did this happen? So I got real angry, right? Because I was like, this is racist nonsense. I'm going to join this committee. I'm going to yell at people. So I wrote them a beautiful little essay. I said, I want to join your committee, okay? And it was the time of year where they were like filling vacancies for it, right? I didn't just appear out of nowhere. And so a couple months later, they got back to me. They said, Sam, you can join our committee. And so the very first meeting I was in, you know, I was like, oh man, okay, I don't want to like piss people off right off the hop, but I do kind of want to like not waste my time, right? So it's kind of like, man, how do I bring this up that, you know, this whole thing's a little bit racist. But then, lo and behold, I didn't even have to bring it up. The very first meeting, someone from the city came and said, you know what? Our Indigenous Relations Manager has done an entire systemic survey of boards and committees in the city of Thunder Bay. And she let us know that actually we have a lot of room to improve around diversity and inclusion. And so it was just really interesting. And I think, so anyways, this person ended up coming to speak to us at a subsequent meeting, and now we're reviewing the entire terms of reference and rewriting it, thinking, so for those of you who are maybe like unfamiliar, like volunteerism, like inherently white, right? Volunteerism like assumes that you have the time and energy and space to do labor for free, right? Which we know like racialized minorities don't have. And so the reason why, well, one of the reasons probably that they had like all white awardees, I don't know if that's the real word. Anyways, the reason why it was all white people, like, is because that system actually like set up white people to be awarded and disadvantaged. And it wasn't just necessarily that the board was made up of people who were like not wanting to award things to brown people, but the whole system was set up for white people to succeed, right? And so that's something now that we're starting to tackle and review. And so kind of one of my key learnings in this so far, I've only been on this board for like 3 months, so but one of my key learnings so far is about noticing like moments in time. And so I think about like the work that Robin's doing, that she did around the smudging policy and the work Jordan's now doing, that it's just kind of like the right time for him to step into that new position. There is something to be said about noticing a moment in time and taking advantage of it. I think also about like in 1996, like the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples made a lot of the same recommendations that came again like 20 years later with the TRC, right? But in 1996, no one cared, right? And so there's something to be said about noticing moments in time, because how we responded as a nation to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its 94 calls to action. Sorry, I must be speaking really fast for the Francophone translation. I'm really sorry. It matters. It matters to notice moments to take advantage of, moments in time. And so that's just like, yeah, a little bit of a story about ways I'm trying to get involved in systems and policy changes in Thunder Bay. And we're running short on time. So if there's any questions, I'd love to be able to try to answer them or get Robert and Jordan to answer some of them. So if you have a question, please drop it in the chat. If not, I can make up some, yeah.
Can I just like riff off of what you just said, actually?
Sure, yeah.
So one of the things that I did last year was an Indigenous policy school, which was pretty amazing. And I remember.
Wait. Why'd you join it, Jordan? How did that come up?
Because a friend of mine passed it along. I don't. So it just like happened on my feed or something.
Okay.
No, it was Sam. Sam told me about it. I owe a lot to Sam. But anyway, one of the speakers, one of the things he talked about was, striking while the iron is hot. And this that idea that like there is a time and sometimes there isn't a time, but you never really know unless you get out there and you try. And in fact, like with this exact same position that I'm doing right now, in November, there was a webinar put on by Canada Foods, and it was called the Just Transition to a Regenerative Food System. And even the fact that like Canada Foods as like a national organization is putting out a webinar by like that title in of itself was such a huge indicator for me that like now is the time to really jump on, like to really forward or like harness that potential energy of Indigenous food sovereignty. And then of course I started talking to tons of people, and there were like, I don't know, at least like a dozen academic people that I knew and like other like community folks who are like also doing this work on top of their normal work. So yeah, it was like a really good time for this position in of itself to happen. So yeah, time.
Yeah, really good, Jordan. I was just thinking also if people prefer, instead of dropping it in the chat, if they want to unmute themselves real quick to share any questions or comments they might have. We have a couple minutes. Okay, so we have a question here. Other than joining a youth advisory council, do you have any advice for Indigenous youth wanting to change policy systems? Robin and Jordan, what comes to mind? Other than youth advisory councils, what are other avenues for engagement for young people, particularly for Indigenous youth?
Well, I don't know. I didn't get a degree. Like I've done a little bit of university and like a little bit of tech school, college, I guess. So I've always kind of like been bumbling around doing different things. Like I'm turning 28 this year, and I'm not like finally settling in, but like I'm like now at a time in my life where I can like do some meaningful work. But I spent a lot of those years previously learning about like colonialism in general. Like where did that come from? Like what does colonialism mean? What's settler colonialism? Like who's impacted by it? Like how can you identify it? And then also like what does that do to like a person's brain? Like looking at like worldviews, and because there's like lots of things that colonialism does that affect our day-to-day lives. And I think understanding and like doing like a lot of homework about like the system that is like pretty significant, because if you don't know like how the system is coming against you, you're not really going to know how to like respond or be able to like find strategic ways to move within the system. And I think learning the system is like pretty important. And a lot of like also what Robin was saying earlier, like harnessing like your own skills and talents and interests as well, for sure.
We have another question here around how do you deal with changing, when changing systems, often you face pushback from professionals. How do you deal with that? Robin, are you interested in answering this one? Because I feel like we saw it a lot.
Yeah, I'll try. So in my presentation, I said that I try not to spend too much time dwelling on this, but you know, it does get exhausting mentally and emotionally. It's, you know, if you're constantly being challenged with every, you know, change that you want to make, yeah, it does, it gets tiring. But I think it's good to find supports and allies within, you know, wherever you are, whether that's in your workplace or your friends, family, whatever. For me, it was because I was doing a lot of this with advice and guidance from the Indigenous Advisory Council, you know, like that was my support system, right? And vice versa. So, and also finding allies too, like within the organization. Yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything, Sam.
Yeah, I would say for me, I think you have to like kind of play to your strengths and like be comfortable in who you are, right? So like my approach to dealing with nonsense from people pushing back is like very different than Robin's, right? Like I'm more argumentative and loud, right? But I think that's fine. And so I think it's about figuring out like not trying to be someone that you're not, right? And then I think that for me, what I had to learn was that like there's kind of a balance to be struck about which fights are worth having, right? And so when I started, I was having every fight and I was winning most of them. It felt pretty good. But I was also like getting really exhausted. And I left, right? After 18 months, like I was done. And so there's something to be said about that. And so I think, yeah, there is kind of like, there's a piece of wisdom in learning like which things are worth really pushing on and which things are like kind of just like let that racism, let that nonsense like slide off your back and you just keep going. I think for me, another thing was like really keeping my eyes on the ball, like really thinking like, I'm not out here to like win over hearts and minds with the staff. I'm out here to make the library, in this case, the library, a safe place for Anishinaabe, right? That was my goal. And so just knowing that I'm not going to like win over every staff member, but that I'm here because I want to serve the community, right? So that was a piece of it for me. But yeah, we're kind of like at the end of our time. So yeah, I can pass it over to Trisha for some closing comments.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Robin, Samantha, and Jordan. It just felt like such an invigorating conversation. I'm going to invite everybody who's here with us today, if you can just go to the reaction section at the bottom of your screen, and if you can tell us what you feel about today's workshop, like how do you feel after hearing everything that you just heard? Let's just give you a second to do that. I see some hearts, some celebrations. Oh, lots and lots of celebrations. Thumbs up, lots of great reactions. That's so great to see, especially because we can't see some of your faces. It's great to see that you had that reaction. So thank you so much again to our speakers for such an incredible, incredible workshop. Really appreciate it. I just have very few closing announcements. Thank you so much for joining us for day one of CBYF. We're so happy that you're here, and we hope that you'll join us again tomorrow. So tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern, we know that we have people from coast to coast, 11 a.m. Eastern, we will have the final day of the CBYF National Gathering, and it will feature an exciting youth panel who'll be talking about the impact of COVID on youth. And we will have a keynote from Carla Qualtrough, who's a Federal Minister of Employment, Workforce Development, and Disability Inclusion. So hope to see you there, and have a good night, everyone. Take care.
Bye, everyone.